Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. If you'd like to take your seats, find your seat as quickly as you can. We've caught up some time, so we're very pleased with ourselves. So thank you so much for coming in and out again. If you were here at the first session, welcome back. And if this is your first session of La Nuit des Idées, welcome, bienvenue. We had an amazing first session. You shouldn't have missed it. It set us up fantastically for the rest of the evening. Ideas were flying, ideas coming out of theatre and performance. And we will continue with those ideas and into a very different subject, but I think you'll find that many of those ideas can be taken forward into the political domain, which we'll be discussing now. I'm Jason Solomons. I should have said that. I said it at the start, but you might have missed that. I'm Jason Solomons. I'm a film critic and presenter and a film producer, and it's always a pleasure to be here at La Nuit des Idées. I pick up loads of ideas for my own work while I'm sitting here listening. And this one is, I'm producing a film called A Waiter in Paris, which is based on the book by Edward Chisholm, which is set in Paris, in modern-day Paris, where many people are coming and flocking to, as they are in all great cities, as victims fleeing war. We have many Ukrainian immigrants here in the UK, as I know that you do in Paris, many working in restaurants. So I'm fascinated to see what the fallout will be from this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. It is Europe at war with a question mark. Things change every day at the moment, don't they? So I'm sure our panel will be alive to the current trends in that. Would you please welcome to the stage all at once? We have a fantastic, the former French Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Colonna. We have Anand, Director of UK in Changing Europe. And we have a surprise guest who's not in your original programme, Sir John Holmes, who's a former British diplomat and a fantastic talker. I'm sure we are delighted to welcome him. And the session will be chaired by Marie Dumoulin, who is Director of the Wider Europe programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. They are all here tonight, though, for La Nuit des Idées.
Good evening. I was just introduced, so I don't need to introduce myself anymore. I will go straight to the topic. Since February 2022, we've seen the return of high-intensity war in Europe, which led Europeans to question basic assumptions that had governed their thinking pretty much since World War II. Russia has challenged fundamental principles of international order, and there are ever new challenges emerging every day or re-emerging all over the globe. And new questions arising, including regarding the role of our main ally and the reliability of the transatlantic solidarity. In that context, how can Europeans cope with this growing uncertainty and with geopolitical turmoil? And to make sense of these issues, I'm very happy to be joined by this fantastic panel. I don't need to introduce them either, so I think we can go straight to the conversation. And I will start with you, Mrs. Minister. You took your office as Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France 3 months into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You paid your first official visit to Ukraine, and you visited it several times during your tenure. Can you share with us your impressions from this first visit, and maybe share how it impacted your thinking and action as a foreign minister?
Thank you. Thank you. It is an important question indeed. Yes, I think I've been 5 times to Ukraine when foreign minister, 4 times in Kiev, and Bucha, Irpin, quite an experience. And once in Odessa, I remember there was a missile attack that day. And also we had so many opportunities to discuss Ukraine, in various formats, whether bilateral or at the UN or within the G7 and the rest. What is impressive is their dignity and their determination. I mean, a calm determination. They're fighting for their land, they're fighting for their freedom, and this is really visible. You can feel it when you're there. And I would say that having been there makes very obvious what it is about. It is a war of aggression. There's one aggressor, and there's a victim. and it's not the same thing. Russia keeps committing war crimes every day, and I mean torture, rape, targeting civilians, executing prisoners of wars. Russia keeps ignoring the decision by the International Court of Justice of March, I think it is March 2022, keeps ignoring the many General Assembly of the United Nations resolutions calling for an immediate, unconditional, and complete withdrawal of the troops. So we have one permanent member of the UN Security Council violating deliberately all major principles of the UN Charter. And this comes after 2008, South Ossetia, Georgia. We'll talk about Georgia later, maybe. And it comes after 2014, Crimea, Ukraine. So what's happening is not an accident, it is a policy. And this is why what is at stake is not only the fate of Ukraine. Of course, it is about the fate of Ukraine. It's freedom, its independence, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity. It is about that, but it's not only about that. It is about the security of the entire continent, and even beyond, probably. Because if an aggression is rewarded, if it pays off, it'll be repeated somewhere else, there or in any other part of the world. And by the way, this is a reason why it should be more of a concern sometimes to many countries of the so-called global south. They are concerned about what's happening. It's not about Europe. One last thing, maybe, to wrap it up. If we do not understand that support must be given to Ukraine because it is also our interest, that would be a huge strategic mistake, a huge strategic mistake. In other words, bargaining support, making transactions about it would be a huge mistake. And you know why I wanted to make this point clear tonight, considering what we hear coming across the Atlantic.
Thank you. Sir Holmes, may I turn to you now? It has often been said that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine triggered a geopolitical awakening of Europeans. How would you assess their reactions? And was it up to the challenge?
I think it was a real wake-up call. Perhaps it shouldn't have been as much of a wake-up call as it was, because as Katrine's just been saying, the signs were there for many years before, and the Ukrainians are very good at reminding us, quite rightly, that they've been fighting a war for many years before 2022, and they'd already lost a chunk of territory in the east and in Crimea, and we had seen the example of Georgia. Nevertheless, a full-scale invasion of Russia, which many people had believed literally until a couple of days before, could never happen, would never happen, despite all the signals. It was a major wake-up call. So how did Europe do? I mean, I think I'd give Europe 6 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 10, for various reasons. I think there was a degree of unity and determination about the response, which took everybody, including perhaps the Europeans themselves, by surprise. A real determination that this should not stand and that Ukraine should be defended. I think there was a generosity of assistance to Ukraine, financial, diplomatic, political, and military, which did Europe credit. Not always sufficient, perhaps, but still it was there, and it has continued. I think there was a generous response to the Ukrainians themselves, to the refugees. I think there was a unified response in terms of sanctions, which again wasn't obvious because there were lots of serious interests at play there, not least for those who were so dependent on Russian gas supplies, but some very difficult decisions were taken. I think there was a very commendable unity of effort with the United States, which wasn't self-evident either. That was very good too. And I think there was a wider response in Europe in the sense that new members of new European countries became new members of NATO in Sweden and Finland, which again was not at all self-evident before this happened. So I think there was an awakening. There was a new seriousness about defence and security, which hadn't been there before. Europe had been living perhaps in a bit of a fool's paradise for many years and depending too much on the American big brother to defend them. So that's all good. So why don't I say 10 out of 10? Why is it 6 out of 10? Or maybe it should be 7, but anyway, let's not argue about that too much. I think some of the support was hesitant, slow to develop. The Ukrainians have always said, with some justice, that what they got was too little too late, and that there was a huge debate about tanks, and there was a huge debate about airplanes, and there's been another huge debate about missiles. If these things had been given earlier, they could have been more use on the battlefield, and there's some truth in that. I think the Europeans, I'm talking about the UK as well, I'm not distinguishing the UK from Europe in this particular context, were at times rattled by Putin's rhetoric, and let's face it, no one wants to fight a nuclear war because we're all dead. So that's a very good reason to be cautious, but I think we were probably a bit too impressed by that rhetoric when we shouldn't have been, and that bluff could have been called a bit earlier. I think some of the implementation of the sanctions has been patchy. And I think there has been, over time, a waning of European determination to resist. That's, again, it's patchy, it's different in different countries, and it's perhaps more visible. Let's leave aside the outliers like Hungary, but we must remember they're there, and there are more of them now because there's a concerted effort by Russia to turn people the other way. But leave them aside for the moment. Even in the countries which have not gone in that direction at all, there has been a bit of a waning of support and a greater desire for peace. Understandable, because the war is horrible in every possible respect. I say it's perhaps more visible in public opinion than it is in governmental opinion, but that has an effect on governments as well, and that's a worrying phenomenon, which we have to watch. And of course, the identification of the far right with Russia, which is bizarre in every possible way, is definitely there in many places, and that's also worrying. I think that the thing that worries me the most is that the recognition that Europe needed to do more to defend itself, needed to spend more on defense, more on security, take that issue more seriously, has not really translated into the reality it should have done yet. There's been a lot of rhetoric, not much real spending, and the UK, I'm afraid, is not an exception in that sense. There's more than a sense in lots of European countries of that old sort of prayer, God make me virtuous, but not yet. So yes, we will spend more money on defense, but not quite yet. And I think, frankly, that just isn't good enough. We can all understand it. Governments and public opinion want to spend money on hospitals and schools and social care homes and all the thousands of things that governments have got to spend money on. But this is so fundamental that we're not doing enough, and that's why I think that we're at 6 or 7 out of 10 and not at 10 out of 10. And the proof of the pudding is this, really. If the Americans, who knows what Trump will do? I don't think he knows, so how would we know? But whatever he does about Ukraine, if he sort of abandoned them, could we take the Americans' place? The true answer to that is no, we couldn't. We could try, but we would be nowhere near, either financially or in weapon systems or in weapons or other support. And that should still be a wake-up call for us that we need to do more.
Thank you. Anand, let me turn to you. So Holmes just mentioned that Europeans were unexpectedly united in their policies and in their reactions to the full-scale invasion. Already very early in the war, you expressed concerns that this unity may not last and that Europeans may not be able to keep it. Looking back at the last 3 years, would you say they have managed to keep united? And has this unity allowed them to act more decisively, or was it achieved through lowering their level of collective ambition?
I think through lowering a level of collective ambition is the answer. I mean, if I can, partly I want to be devil's advocate a little bit here and say that I think Sir John is very generous giving us a 6 for our response to Ukraine. I mean, we sometimes forget we are signatories to a treaty that guarantees the territorial integrity of Ukraine in return for them giving up their nuclear weapons back in 1994. And boy, must they feel stupid to have trusted us. So, there is a betrayal here because we signed a piece of paper saying we won't let this happen to you. And when it comes to European unity, yes, there's been, sometimes Europeans pat themselves on the back for being united, even if they're not doing very much with their unity. And one of the things, yes, we've managed to have a sanctions regime, though even that has taken a lot of difficult negotiations because we don't want to hurt anyone in the West too much. Yes, we've given them weapons, but knowingly given them enough weapons to allow for just about a stalemate, but never giving them quite enough to actually gain the advantage in the war. And I mean, my fear about Europe is that the really difficult choices and debates and negotiations are going to come, because at some point there might be the question about whether we can replace the United States. We can't. But then there's going to be the question of rebuilding Ukraine and policing whatever settlement we have left. And my fear on both of those is that European unity will be stretched to breaking point because the costs are going to be huge. And Lord alone knows there's not a lot of money to go around within our countries, let alone for helping in our near abroad.
Okay, I think this first round of questions was not very uplifting. I'll continue with similar questions, and I'll stick with you, Anand, if you allow. The geopolitical picture has significantly shifted over the last weeks, with the US becoming a wild card in international relations. Are Europeans prepared to deal with this new situation of uncertainty and potentially with challenges to their security originating from their main ally?
Absolutely and incontrovertibly not. And all right, I won't go on for too long and give you a sermon, but let me say several things. Firstly, we focus on Trump, rightly, because he's clearly like a maniac and massively unpredictable and says and does things that no other president would. But it is absolutely clear, and it has been absolutely clear for a while, that the secular trend in American politics, whether you have a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, has been away from free trade, away from globalization, a greater focus on China, less interest in Europe. That's going to happen whoever is in the White House. And we were given a warning in 2016 when Trump won first time, and I think it is unforgivable, really, that more hasn't been done in the interim, because, I mean, the sad fact is, and I'm not denying for a moment there are very, very difficult fiscal choices involved in this. Europe got very comfortable free riding on the Americans throughout the Cold War. The Americans did the bulk of the spending, the Americans provided the bulk of the kit. We couldn't even defeat Libya without the help of the United States. We got used to that situation. Subsequent to the start of the war in Ukraine, we've got better at talking a good game. So we've announced our intentions to do more. And to be fair, I mean, one of the most revealing things is if you look at a map of Europe with defense spending as a proportion of GDP on it, there's an absolute correlation between the closer you are to Russia, the more you're spending on defense. Okay, it's absolutely crystal clear. But Europe as a whole waking up to the fact that at a certain point in time, it's not going to be able to depend on the United States, whether it's Trump or not. There's been very, very little movement on this. And I think, it's very, very, if this war and this president aren't enough to impel the sort of sense of urgency that is needed to take decisions, then God alone knows what will be, to be honest. I could say something happy just for the sake of it, if you,
Maybe later. I'll turn back to you, Sir Holmes, and maybe as a former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, because war is unfortunately not the privilege of the European continent. Fundamental principles of international law and of humanitarian law are being challenged in various parts of the world. How can Europeans ensure that the international rules-based order survives?
Well, let me just make a comment on what Anand said first. I mean, I do agree with a lot of what he said. I was being more generous, maybe because my expectations at the beginning were lower. So that, I think Europe did better than many people thought, but we're still a long way from where we should be, and I think we agree on that. On the wider rules-based order, I mean, let's not pin it all on Trump. He's got lots of problems, and I'll come to them in a minute, perhaps. But even before that, if you think about the last 10 years, you can see that what we'd taken for granted in the international world order, what had been built up since the founding of the UN and so on, and all the kind of things that went with that, the idea of respect for international law, respect for human rights, the idea of universal human rights, the idea that we were interested in what happened to people in another country, the idea of democracy itself, the idea of peaceful resolution of disputes wherever possible, with force only ever a last and very undesirable resort. All those things were being undermined and threatened, together with the multilateral institutions themselves, as places where you could go to resolve problems. And that had weakened the will to resolve problems. And this was being fed, obviously, by Putin and by the Chinese leadership, but also by leaders like Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, and others too. This sort of authoritarian narrative, and they work with each other on this, the idea that democracy has had its day and is too weak and can't take any decisions. All this was happening already, and it, I think, is profoundly worrying. Because we thought in our arrogance, in 1990 that Francis Fukuyama and all that. Let's not go there now. But that sort of all these ideas had won, and although we didn't respect a lot of these principles ourselves, and we valued them in the breach and so on, nevertheless we thought they were right, and we thought that over time they would gain universal acceptance. And that simply hasn't happened. And it's being rolled back in a really worrying sense. And I'm afraid, Donald Trump, too, is only going to aid that, because he clearly doesn't believe in international law or rules-based systems, either in trade or anything else, and behaves like a medieval monarch, where as if nothing has any of this had happened in the last 100 years, which is very different from anything we've seen from American presidents before, even if the trend towards isolationism, is a secular one. It's not just Trump. He is still very different as an individual. So the question is, what can we do about that? Now, we can't fix it ourselves as Europeans, but we have to be the torchbearers for all those things I was talking about. For democracy, for respect for international law, for respect for human rights, and all the things that go with that. Because if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? We may have some allies, occasionally in Asia and Japan and Korea and Australia and New Zealand and other places, Canada. But essentially, Europe has to be the torchbearer for this, which is a rather uncomfortable position to be in if everybody else is going in a different direction. Not everybody else, but a lot of other people, and the narrative is drifting in that sense. And we may have to be, the voices crying in the wilderness for some time, I fear, because it's not going to reverse quickly, because that narrative of authoritarians can get stuff done. And the most worrying thing of all, just in parenthesis, is that young people here and elsewhere in Europe seem to be buying into the notion that what we really need is dictators, not democracy. As if there has ever been a benevolent dictator. I don't think, I've never heard of one. Because people don't really understand what it's like to live under a dictatorship rather than living in a democracy. I think that's really naive. Anyway, we have to be the standard bearers for this, and to keep defending it and keep defending the multilateral institutions and the multilateral way forward as much as we can. Yes, of course, they need reforming. The Security Council is disgracefully unreformed and is undermining the whole UN system because of that, but that's not very easy to solve. And other institutions, no doubt, need reform as well, but let's not bin the lot and pretend that the world will be better without them. It certainly would not. So we need to defend all those things as much as we can. Now, individual countries, and you can see this in this country and elsewhere, will need to accommodate Trump, grovel to Trump, flatter Trump, whatever they feel they need to do to defend their bilateral interests. But while they're doing that, they should be at bottom defending the values and principles which are absolutely fundamental to us. And let us hope that, as usually happens, the pendulum will swing back at some point. And we will be proved right again.
Thank you. At least some hope in this discussion. Mrs. Minister, maybe I turn to you and pick up where Sir Holmes left, because world politics seems to be heading towards an increasingly competitive and transactional modus operandi. And I was wondering how Europeans can cope with such an environment. Should they just increase their defenses and become a carnivore among carnivores? Or should they try to preserve some cooperative spirit, first and foremost, among themselves?
I very much agree with what Sir John said, including being a tiny bit optimistic once in a while. We have to, or we would do another job, right, John? We have to. No, indeed, we are living a very peculiar moment in the history of the world. It is chaotic, clearly. It is shaky. It is even dangerous. The world is literally burning, and I'm not talking about climate change here. You know, it is burning, and I see too many arsonists. I mean, not just one. John, you said it, decades of looking for the common good, decades of global cooperation have ended. The international order is challenged, and not only it is challenged, but it is not respected. And not respected, again, not just by one state or one actor. Of course, you can easily see that through the eye of the Ukrainian war and what Russia does. It does not respect, I've mentioned it, does not respect any of the basic principles of the Charter. But the United States, forgive me, had a great, efficient, attracting investment policy called ERA, which is not in line with the WTO rules. China's been a member of WTO for the past, 24 years or so. They've never played by the book. And we could name a few other nations. So it is a world where conflictuality is on the rise, fragmentation is there, polarization is there, and we tend to forget that what we call the international order, basically a rules-based system, there are rules to play that game, is what allowed a relatively peaceful coexistence between nations and allowed economic expansion and progress. And too many actors, state actors and non-state actors, and non-state is not only terrorist, can think about other forms of not being the state but being powerful, tend to forget that. And they're not looking for that anymore. They act as if there were no rules. You know, they are tempted by the law of the strongest. They're tempted by the use of force as first resort and not last resort, as it should. And all this can only create problems. I'm being very polite when I say problems. You know, big problems, conflicts, basically. And I'd like to come back to your words. You mentioned competition. It is not only competition. It's not even an intense competition. Competition can be positive. It is another game. You know, it is a different game. And you mentioned, and many people, when they comment the current situation after the election of President Trump, re-election of President Trump, say it's transactional. I wouldn't call it transactional. It is use of threat. It is, you know, it's more coercion than transaction. Forgive me, I'm not being very diplomatic there. But that's what is at stake. You know, where are we going? Are we going to have a new, different equilibrium? Or is it just going to be just messy and chaotic as it is with all the risks attached to that, including for those who promote that, you know, free-for-all system, every man for himself system. So Europe in all that, well, First, clearly we need to build a stronger Europe. Of course, it would be good for Europeans. I tend to believe it would be good for the United States of America as well, though they often forget it, but we're not that many to be democratic countries. John mentioned it as well. And it would be good for the rest of the world, I believe, for many reasons. One of the major reasons being that Europe is a cooperative model. It is not based on confrontation. We decided to stop confrontation and to try to put in common whatever good we could have and create for the common good. So that's one. Second, I do not buy the pessimistic view about Europe. I know it is a touchy subject here in the UK. I'm not talking about Brexit. I just want to express my strong belief, it has always been my belief, that it is the smartest idea we've had in the past 75 years. Not only it brought an end to those wars that we had between our nations. My dad did fight the war, his dad did fight the war, the dad of his dad did fight the war, and we were left not only ruined, but at the verge of destroying the very idea of humanity. And it did provide a framework for, again, economic and social progress. And we did a lot. We have achieved the internal market. We have a trade policy. We now have a European pillar within NATO. We did a lot for Ukraine, adding everything together. Europe did more than the United States. It's not a competition, it's not a beauty contest, but we are there. We have a defense capacity, I repeat. We have now a defense fund. We invented the beautifully named European Peace Facility, which means a capacity, financial capacity to buy arms, hence its name, for Ukraine so it can defend itself. And again and again and again. But yes, we have to do more. And this, of course, the third point I would make. We have to do more, go further, go faster, be more agile, as we say today. And this is something that you will hear from President Macron, and obviously for France it is a classic. Every single president would say that. You hear it from the President of the Commission, you hear it from the President of the European Parliament, but you also hear it, and this is new, from so many governments, including Nordic countries or frugal countries or countries that used to be shy about European integration. And they now agree, they just had a meeting a few days ago, to do more for defense. And defense is not only about defense spending in terms of GDP, even though I think we do our share, and with two programmation legislation, France in 10 years will have doubled, twofold its defense budget. But it's not only about budget, it's also about capacities, we all know that. We have to do more in industry. We've been too much relying on third countries. We must invest in tech, whether it is biotech, clean tech, robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. There's an agreement on that. I mean, the plan is there, now we have to do it. President Macron just said when you arrived at that meeting, we know everything, now we have to implement it. How can we do it? Fourth and last point. I see two key elements. Unity, and of course some will try to divide us. Friends or foes, mostly foes, but sometimes close friends as well. When we know that our unity is our strength. It is the biggest commercial market in the world. We can have together huge power. So unity. Second, invest, following the Draghi report or the letter recommendations. And I would personally add a third key element. Be strong. I mean, if attacked, we have to respond, retaliate if needed, hoping it will not be needed, but if needed, yes. I mean, we must not be complacent or naive. It will not work. It will not work with the US, at least the current administration, but they're not so different in a way than all previous administrations. They're thinking about America first, and they have to. It's quite normal. But this one is a bit, in the methodology, a bit peculiar. Certainly it would be useless to sit there and smile and hope to be spared. It will not work. And vis-à-vis Russia, it did not work. It did not work. Unfortunately, we have to realize that European democracies are under attack heavily, not only with that war in Ukraine, but with hybrid attacks, cyber, disinformation. We've debunked and made public many cases, sabotage in the Nordic, in the Baltic Sea, interference in elections. We've seen that in Romania, and I say hello to my former colleague, the ambassador of Romania. We've been close to seeing it as well in Moldova. We're seeing it right now in Georgia. I briefly mentioned 2008 earlier. We saw in France a tentative in 2017, and I don't know about other countries, but it could well be true that there were other tentatives and other problems. And in a way, it brings me back to your first question, about my experience about that war in Ukraine, how important it is, and so on. I think it is central. I think it is absolutely central. It is for us. We cannot afford to lose that battle. Thank you.
I think we have a few more minutes for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. I would ask you to keep your questions short, if possible. I see one here. Is there a microphone? Yes, there is one. So one here, one there, and one at the very end. Here. So 2 here, actually. So yeah, let's start from anyway.
Good evening. Isn't there the solution maybe perhaps a 2-phase solution in the long term, meaning in parallel, a short term of investing into defense and spending money on trying to combat this, but in the long term, isn't this a humanistic issue in terms of education, in terms of the people to realize what we're getting ourselves into by having these wars and spending on defense, and it's cultivating more wars and so on. So maybe shouldn't the education part of the new generation be integrated at the same time while we're trying to combat the short-term fix?
Well, a quick answer from mine. Yes, of course, we must do both. We usually do both. And if you mean it's a bad idea to shut down USAID, please make it public, because that's about what it is.
Thank you. Out of curiosity and solidarity, I visited Ukraine in August, and browsing the bookshop in the main street of Kreshchatyk in Kiev, I noticed there were 7 books on Churchill in English and 7 books on Churchill in Ukrainian. That I could understand historical sentiment, but frankly, it left me worried. Would the panelists agree?
I'm not sure what the question was, but I'll let the panelists phrase it as a question. There was another question over there. Oh, no, there were 2. So we'll take the 2. And then, yeah, please keep it short.
Hello, I'm a Ukrainian living in London, and actually I happen to come from the town of Irpin, and I'm very grateful to Catherine Colonna for visiting the town and drawing attention to what is really happening to Ukraine and the aftermath, the consequences of the Russian aggression. My question is a bit of a hypothetical one. If Russia, let's say, attacks one of the Baltic countries, do you believe that the NATO will respond? And how? Thank you.
So can you pass the microphone here?
Shall I ask my question? Super. I have a question to each of you. Anastasia Verdanska, British-Ukrainian, London resident for many years. To Madame Colonna, I'd like to ask you, you said a lot of important things, how we should respond, how European policies did not work with Russia. France is the largest consumer of Russian LNG today. Total Energies signed long-term contracts to buy Russian LNG until 2032. So wouldn't be a good move to do something about it and to show concrete actions. To Sir John, given your esteemed experience at the United Nations, you said it will be very difficult to reform the Security Council given the obstruction of Russia supported by China. So why are we allowing these institutions to exist? So if it's impossible, difficult to reform them. And to Anand, just a question about Britain. What are we going to do about Russian frozen assets? If there is shortage of funds to support Ukraine, why just not passing legislation similar to the US and to start transferring Russian frozen assets to Ukraine so they can use those funds appropriately? Thank you.
Okay, so now we have much more than 2 or 3 questions, and we still have very little time to conclude the discussion. Maybe I will go just basically in this order, and you pick up the questions that you want to answer. So we have one on investing in defense and investing in education, one on Churchill and what Churchill means for Ukraine, one on an attack on the Baltic states and NATO reaction, and then we have personal questions to each of you. So Holmes, please.
Okay, let me start quickly. I mean, I think I've already said we definitely need to invest more in defence. Despite all the other fiscal pressures, it's absolutely fundamental. And it needs to be more than 2.5% of GDP. It should be 3% at least. And that's going to be really tough, and it probably isn't going to happen, but that's what we should do, because that's the critical situation we're facing. It's not that the World War III is going to start tomorrow. I mean, the Russians, armed forces are exhausted by what they're doing now, so they're not going to attack anybody else except some minnow in the near future. But we just, if you want peace, prepare for war is a very old Roman adage, and it's absolutely true about the present, so we really need to do that. We do need to educate people. And I said already, I think one of the most worrying things I see at the moment is young people in the West thinking that democracy doesn't work. And that maybe, or some more authoritarian system will get stuff done. As so often, Churchill had it right. I think this is a genuine quote rather than one of the false quotes. He said, democracy is the worst possible form of government except for all the others. And that's absolutely right. And we've got all sorts of weaknesses, and there always will be in democracies, but it's still the best thing we've got, and we should hang on to it and persuade young people that that's absolutely fundamental for their future. The question about would we go to the aid of a Baltic state if it was invaded by Russia, the answer has to be yes. If the answer is not yes, we're lost. They're lost. Europe is lost. Now, you can speculate about, and I'm thinking the Americans do this too, would we really go to war with Russia over Estonia? And you can ask that question in a pub in Britain. I'm not sure what answer you get. But the answer has to be firmly from governments, and it has to be said with conviction and sincerity. The answer has to be yes. I'm absolutely convinced about that. And on the point about Churchill, I'm not quite sure what point you were trying to get at. I mean, the point about Churchill as a politician is that he was a terrible politician for most of his life and a bellicose nuisance to successive British governments. But when it came to one particular point about the threat from Nazi Germany, he was right. And, you know, so the lesson for today is that there is a real threat from Russia, whether you call it Nazi Russia or whatever, it doesn't matter what you call it really, but it's there. We have to respond in that sort of way and not in a mealy-mouthed way to the situation.
He was specific that America was going to save us in 1940. He wasn't even trying to be sly about it. He was quite specific about it.
Well, he thought that and he was right and he got them in the war. So.
I think you can continue the conversation after the panel is over because we don't have much more time. Mrs. Minister.
Some former minister. I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. Short answers would be yes, yes, yes to what Sergeant said. Yes, we must invest more in education. I've said it already. And moderate social media, which is part of the issue, but this is becoming a real serious issue. Yes, we must depend more on defense, though again, it's about capacity as well as spending, but the current spending is insufficient to provide the security we need, I would say. And yes, Churchill was a great man. No. Yes, we are here to prevent that such a situation happens. Should it happen, even though we should never, ever answer hypothetical questions, the answer would be yes. Article 5 of NATO, Article 42.7 of the European Treaty, and there should be no doubt about that. Oh, LNG, yeah, and that was specifically addressed to me. We're phasing out. We've stopped any coal coming from Russia. I think we were the first ones to do that. We stopped oil, and we're phasing out LNG. I would add that historically, we've been much less dependent on Russian capacities than some other European countries, big ones or smaller ones, by the way, thanks to the nuclear energy we have, and that was a wise choice.
Anand, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, just two of them. On the city and Russian assets, they absolutely should be transferred to Ukraine. Why are we taking so long? Because there are a lot of voices in the city that don't like the implications of doing it, and there's a difficult political argument taking place. I don't know which way it will go. And I'm not convinced we'd go to war for the Baltic states. I mean, I understand the reason why every politician has to say, yes, we will. But let's face it, the Russians are committing acts of aggression against us now. They're cutting undersea cables, which is an act of aggression, and we're trying to smooth it over. A little bit of hybrid warfare nibbling around the edges of Latvia. I'm far from convinced we do very much at all, to be honest.
Okay, I was hoping to finish on an optimist note, but next time. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the speakers.